I did that literally to scare Nora because she was worried that I would trip on the stairs, so I jumped up. So that was for you. Oh my gosh, that was fun. I'll just put that up there. I can feel your heart beating from the stage. Don't you love it? And I just wanted to wake everybody else up too. Someone said earlier, well, hey, it's lunchtime, so hopefully you'll have the type of energy that'll be great. So I figured if I fell, that would really wake you up. It's tough. So thank you for that introduction, and thanks for pitching in at the last moment. I won't spend too much time giving a lot of detail on me, but I do want to do a little bit of an introduction to me that'll go beyond sort of bios, which I know is in the materials somewhere, give you a little bit of an introduction to Smart Growth America, give you an introduction of things I've heard that you guys are interested in, scared about, and the like, and then talk about solutions and how we can kind of work on these things. And by way of introduction, I'll tell you a little bit of a story from last night. Which a couple of people already chuckled because they've heard this story. So yesterday, I walk in, there was a reception, it was great, talking to people, public service announcement, I'm giving them the forearm smash or the hug, but no hands, that kind of thing. And I see this woman, and she says, hey, and we're talking, and we're like, wait a minute, we've met. She's like, yeah, we have met. We had met 10 years ago. I'm a trustee for the Urban Land Institute, and I was here working with the ULI Austin a while back, and so she and I had met. And so we're talking and we're laughing. We're like, man, we had met. This is so good. And we remembered each other, because sometimes that's creepy, right? When the person's like, that's right, we met at 7 o'clock at this bar, and you're like, So it was great. We're in that good moment, and then her boss comes up. And her boss says, oh, hi, forearm smash. And she says, hi, let me introduce you to Malcolm Gladwell. True story. And I'm not going to tell you Erica's name and shout her out in this meeting and ask you whether she's actually in this room, because she is. But by virtue of introduction, that happened to me yesterday. So I knew this was going to be a fun time. You can't make this stuff up. And by the way, speaking of making things up, if you guys are on Twitter or Instagram, that's my social media handle, Smart Growth CEO. So let's let everybody know what we're talking about here. We can do this in public, we can do this in private, but so we can do the social media thing too. So introductions to me, things that don't show up on the bio. Probably the number one thing is, this is where I grew up. I grew up in public housing in a small town in New York called Brooklyn. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of it, been there. It's near Hoboken. So I also like to tell folks, don't let the pocket square fool you, because that's where I'm from. So don't get it twisted, as some might say. And I learned a lot in that sort of former lived experience. Does color, no pun intended, color the way I think about things and how I approach all of these issues. I was just saying to someone earlier too that I have this kind of none of the above background. So I'm a fully recovered attorney. I was a real estate attorney at one point. Started doing affordable housing, started working for city government, but I don't have a planning degree. I don't have an economics degree. I didn't go to business school. I'm not an architect, none of those things. So that's why you're going to see all these slides and you're going to say, how did he put all that together? It's because I have this sort of none of the above background, but it allows me to sort of, as Richard Rothstein does in his book, sort of unpack sort of lurking assumptions that we have about things that we never question because it's just in the ether. Because we come from these siloed disciplines that have a methodology and a way of thinking about things, and we start with those premises and never take a step back. So luckily, based on my background, I'm sort of able to just come at it fresh. So a little bit of an introduction. I also like to show this picture. I was a real estate developer and a consultant. I actually worked for Bridge Housing in San Francisco, if anybody knows Bridge. And this was, I co-developed a multifamily building in Washington, D.C. I'm standing next to the mayor of D.C., Muriel Bowser there. It's the groundbreaking. And I always like to show this slide, one, because if you notice, I'm the only one moving dirt there. Like, nobody told me that you were just supposed to, didn't know. So when you come from public housing, there's things you're learning on the fly still, right? But also, I think it's illustrative of what we're going to do today, which is let's not just talk concepts, let's talk about how you get stuff done. So let's move some dirt today. So just want to go there. My organization, some of you may have never heard of it, Smart Growth America. We're a national nonprofit headquartered in DC, about 35 employees, but we work around the country and we would love to come back here to Austin. But I always like to put our North Star up to just explain why we exist, because we're trying to work with you and work on all of these issues to get to a place where it doesn't matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And I got to imagine that all of you in the room, this is what you want for Austin. Folks should be healthier. They should be able to share in the prosperity that happens when you revitalize communities. And also they should be self-actualized and actually have some power, more than just input, but power in these decisions. And that's what we try to do at Smart Growth America. One other last thing is we're kind of like this family of organizations. So I don't know if anybody here has heard of Transportation for America or our National Complete Streets Coalition or Locus, our triple bottom line coalition of developers, impact investors, and alike. So there's all these sort of companies that are part of the Smart Growth umbrella. So you may know of them, but they're all part of Smart Growth. So just to give you a sense that we have a very kind of interdisciplinary organization. And that actually really reflects in some ways the way I think about things as well. So it's kind of cool to kind of have such a great team of folks. So those are a little bit of introductions, but I did want to also do some introductions, just some things that I've learned about Austin. And actually I got this from the great folks and wanted to definitely give a shout out not only to Nora for helping bring me here, Francie from NeighborWorks, but even Siobhan and Julie in the back for keeping the trains running on time, but also giving me some of this stuff to play with. So thank you. And telling me to go to the Continental Club yesterday, which was also fun. So, yeah. But like some of the things that seem to be top of the mind here really relate to housing, and I just thought these metrics about cost burden and the idea that if you spend 30% of your income or more on housing, that's considered being cost burden, and if you spend 50% or more, it's extremely cost burden. And you can see sort of Austin as a city, folks in Austin are more cost burden than even generally folks in Texas. And then you could sort of do comparisons around the country. And I was actually talking to folks yesterday as well and saying, you know, another way you could splice this is to say, what is the cost burden for low income renters in Austin? And would these numbers go up? And then you could do some data visualization, you could do some mapping, and you could say, well, where are the most cost burden low income renters in the city? And then where do they live in what I might call tipping point neighborhoods, pre-gentrification and displacement neighborhoods? So then you can say, well, if we don't have unlimited resources and we need to prioritize, maybe our most important interventions need to be in those neighborhoods where the folks are most cost burdened, they're the most vulnerable because of their low wealth status and the challenges they have in terms of resources, and that's where we should put our money first. That's where we should put our priorities. So it's a way to take this kind of information and unpack it and actually use it as a tool, because sometimes we create data and we only use it as information rather than as a part of the solution set. So that just sort of jumped out at me when I saw this. I also saw just information about transit choices and just the idea that this still is a kind of automobile-dominated city. And you can just, I mean, these numbers alone say basically everybody drove. I mean, how many people here took a scooter to this event today? Hey, let's give that man a round of applause. There's always at least one. But we're mostly, how many people drove here or was in a car share of some sort? Almost everybody. And so we all know for a variety of reasons, and we'll talk about it, that an automobile dominant both design of a city, but also our choices have very long-term negative effects. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but if you just think about the existential threats to all of us, and I'll say, I think these are the three. I won't say the T word, by the way, that rhymes with bump, but I won't include that. I would say the three are climate change, public health, and equity. And a lot of those problems are exacerbated by, or actually caused by, these type of transportation decisions and the design of our cities and our communities. So that jumped out at me when just looking at these transit and realizing how stark it was here in Austin and thinking about how do you unpack that and how do you change it. Anybody recognize this person here? Anybody recognize Jimmy? Jimmy said he was running for governor of New York in 2010, and he said, the rent is too damn high. And apparently, this is a challenge in Austin, right? Affordability. So I just wanted to note that this is going to be one of the things we'll talk about, is affordability, issues. Just give you some fun visuals. Julie, I mentioned that Oakland was going to show up in this presentation. Here you go. So I'm hearing that there's issues about gentrification and displacement, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I just want to give you a sense of things that I think were top of mind. And by the way, I know we're using Slido, and there'll be ways to ask questions. So there are other things at top of mind that I haven't gotten to. Let's get to those too. We're ad-libbers here, right? So we can just like make stuff up, right? And now that I have the microphone, you really can't stop me. So, well, that guy could stop me, but I paid him off earlier. So, and then third, I'm hearing that there are issues of scared of change. And so we'll talk about that and how to think about those issues, and as we're trying to solve problems, how to address these kind of fears and what that means. So, and why don't I like to sort of give you the answer before I actually go into the details. So what I'm going to do is, if you want to deal with these issues of housing, questions about gentrification and displacement, worries about affordability, worries about equity and the like. And I love the fact that this event is called Housing Plus Access. I think that was very smart. But what I'm going to say to you is, if you want to deal with these issues, and particularly critically about housing, then I'm going to tell you to do three things. And it'll be the three H's, so it's easy to remember. The first is, you got to think about, you got to unpack, you got to talk about, you can't be scared of the history. Talk about that. Secondly, you can't just talk about housing, you have to have a holistic mindset in thinking about these issues, and it can't just be about housing. People don't have housing issues, they have housing, transportation, food, education, safety, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They have all those issues. They're all interconnected. And if we keep coming up with siloed solutions, we're going to go solve housing, we won't be able to do it. So we'll talk about what it means to think holistically. And then finally, and maybe even most importantly, we have to start with, prioritize, and always think about health and equity first. Health and equity has to be a defined outcome of any housing solution you put forward. Because if you don't, you won't get there. You can't graft that on the end. So those are the three H's, and we'll sort of get into those. So, talk about history. So I took this picture myself. This is actually 2 blocks down from my house in Washington, D.C. proper. This was a small Jamaican restaurant, 2-story restaurant. It was sold. Actually, they kicked out, the restaurateurs were renters, so they kicked them out. And they were redeveloping this property, supposed to be condos. And one day we woke up and someone had written in chalk. And you could see there's the public notice of the zoning hearing. Greg is shuddering in the audience. And they had written, gentrification is racism. Gentrification is racism. And I do this talk every once in a while called Everything You Know About Gentrification is Half Right. And I would say this is half right. Because first of all, and this might be controversial, I've looked to see where the exits are so I can get out of here, but the issue, and we can talk about this, we can do this in Q&A, the issue is not gentrification, it's displacement. We should be fighting, if we're talking about solution sets, you don't solve for gentrification, you solve for displacement. Cultural displacement, physical displacement, spiritual displacement, displacement of people's histories, their presence in a place. So let's stop trying to solve for gentrification. We want to stop gentrification. Gentrification, if you look at the definition, it actually started in Britain, actually. And gentrifiers were literally talking about people with higher incomes coming into an area, and their incomes are higher than the people in that area. That's what actually literally gentrification means. And now people use the term, and I'm going to push you to change your vocabulary and say, it's not gentrification itself that's the problem. It's the displacement. It's the folks that lived and survived and suffered through disinvestment that were in the neighborhood, were in my neighborhood in Coney Island where I grew up, in Brooklyn, that don't get a chance to stay or feel like they moved out, or this place is no longer for them. So in some ways, they're not physically displaced, but they have to leave. Or like I've heard here in Austin, property taxes rise, and although you own your home, you can't afford the property taxes, so you get displaced that way. It's about the displacement. I mean, we all know how the market tends to work. You have to get more income, more disposable income, more people, and I'll say the D word, density, typically to get the type of amenities, grocery, retail, and other things you like. Now, that's where I say this is not all wrong, because in some ways gentrification is racism, because it shouldn't be that Latinx, Black and brown people, if you say it that way, people of color, if you want to use that term, it shouldn't be that the only way our communities get invested in is when people of higher income come into them. So in some ways, there is a race aspect or a class aspect to gentrification, just in the sense of sometimes the catalyst for change, suddenly neighborhoods get new sidewalks, suddenly they get new trees, and it's all because of new incomes coming into the neighborhood. And there is a correlation, because oftentimes those folks with new incomes are of a different race. But I say everything you know about gentrification is half right, because if you go to Houston as an example, you'll find that the gentrifiers are Latinx, and they're moving and displacing out people who are Latinx. So we always picture it's sort of like a richer white person moving in and moving out a person of color, but that's not how it works. If you go to parts of Boston, if you go to Chinatown, you'll find that some of the displacers, some of the gentrifiers are Asian, and they look just like the people they're displacing who are also Asian. And I would say, some of you guys are gentrifiers as well. So let's get out of the gentrification conversation and let's talk about displacement. But it's important to kind of, just dive in. And Richard was here talking about his awesome book, and so I just wanted to sort of grab onto that. And when you're talking about history, and you know the saying, past is prologue, you have to. I was speaking at a conference in Atlanta, and someone raised their hand, a white woman, and said, "Hey, well, how can I be a white ally?" It was like, how much time do you have? And I said, well, one is you have to think about it as a verb, not a noun. You need to do things to be an ally. You need to support when I or someone of color that you're trying to support is not in the room. That's when you're an ally. It's an action term. But the other thing I said is you got to know the history. Because oftentimes we come into, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, we come into meetings and we're trying to solve problems and we have no idea of what the history is. So one, we don't understand what people are coming to the meeting in the back of their minds or in the front of their minds. So we want to come talk about the project, the plan, the land development code. We want to talk about the thing of the day, but the history is still there. And we haven't acknowledged the history. And until we acknowledge, unpack, and actually are courageous enough to say these things are true and this is how we got here, we never really will get to the right solutions because we haven't thought about the history. And the color of law is a good example of that. And I'll just give you one example that actually starts to show how these things are holistic and interconnected. So, color of law. How many people here saw Richard speak earlier? Most folks. So hopefully folks have read the book. But you had these redlining maps, and I'll give you an example from Richmond, Virginia. You had these redlining maps, and obviously these were the neighborhoods that they said, well, hey, these are the dangerous areas, don't go there, we're not going to insure those areas. And that's how you had all the domino effects that Richard talked about. Well, these domino effects are not just limited to housing. And I want to give you an example that may not be top of mind, but it's pretty interesting. So that's a redlining map in Richmond, Virginia, 1937. I'm going to show you another map. This is a map of the city of Richmond, this idea of urban heat islands. So this is where there are places in a city where it's just hotter. In some places it's hotter because there's impervious pavements, so the sun just comes in. There's a term, albedo, there's all this terminology, but the basic point is things are very hot because of the surfaces, because of the lack of tree canopy, the lack of coverings, all of these various things, green infrastructure, cause certain places in cities to be hot, hotter than usual. And the one thing that's interesting is this map, if you look at this map, now let's go back for a second. Can I go back? Is that going to work? Yes. So go there, go there. Gosh. Well, luckily, I've solved for this problem because this happens all over. So you saw the two maps. Let's go forward. Look at that. The very places where you had communities of color who were singled out, and frankly, it wasn't communities of color, it was mostly African American and Chicano, Latinx, Mexicans that really were the main focus, and probably African Americans predominated. But as you can see, the same places where infrastructure disinvestment basically helps cause these heat island effects. And let me tell you, this is not just about people being too hot. This is a public health concern, right? So if you suffer from dealing with a lot more heat, your blood pressure is higher. It actually causes more stroke, heart attacks. I know I have some masters of public health in the room here, so don't quibble with some of my details, but there are a number of very definitive health outcomes that come from being exposed to extreme and excessive heat. And what we find is, and you can do maps like this all around the country, that you will see heat vulnerability almost line up directly with the redlining maps before. Because those redlining maps didn't just say, hey, this is where those folks should live for housing purposes. It also says where we won't invest, where we won't put the right infrastructure, where we won't have the right mobility options, where we won't have all of those things that make a community resilient. They did those things there too, or they didn't do those things there too. And so we have to know the history, because when we're today trying to solve a problem, we got to understand how we got here, and we have to be clear-eyed and courageous enough to go into that history and know who it was focused on. Now you might be saying, that's Richmond, Virginia. It is not. We're in Austin. Right? What does this got to do with Austin, though? So I found a map that was in Austin, and I don't know if anybody could read that, but this map from 1934, it says racial concentration legend on it. And then it says Negro, Mexican and Negro, and white. And those circled those areas that are outlined there are the areas that they identified that at that time in the city were where all the Mexicans and African Americans lived. Now, they use the term Mexican, so I'm not sure which group they were actually using, but that's the term they use. So they said, hey, we've identified where folks live. Okay. That was the redlining map. And the thing that's most striking, not that it was just exactly the same, but also the yellow says, here are the neighborhoods that are going in the real wrong direction. So not only did they put people in certain areas and then said we can't assure their homes and we're going to disinvest in all these different things, they also said anything near those areas is also going to go down. So that's where the racism comes in. That's where the bias comes in. And that's where you have to understand that history to know how do we solve that now? Because you're going to come in a meeting and you're wondering why these people are fighting and they don't believe you, and you're coming in with good intentions and they're like, I still remember this. So why don't we talk about this before we talk about your solutions? Because you don't seem to even understand where I'm coming from. So we just got to get into the history before we even start getting into the solutions. And particularly when it comes to housing and we're looking for housing solutions, if you don't talk about the history and think about the history, it's going to come up. And you can't solve the issues. And I think a lot of folks have probably seen that in this sort of land development code process. But the history is lurking. So that was my sort of first H. Let's talk about being holistic. Let's go back to Jimmy, word about housing affordability. The rent is too damn high. He's just so kooky looking. I just love that picture. Anybody recognize this game? What's it called? Whack-a-mole. The challenge of, I'll say it in a negative, if you don't have a holistic approach to dealing with housing issues, we're going to run around Austin and play whack-a-mole. So we're going to try to deal with a housing issue here, but a transportation issue is going to pop up there. We're going to build affordable housing in places where people don't have mobility options, and then we're going to raise their combined housing and transportation costs. So you're like, oh, what have I done for their overall quality of living? Well, actually, I've increased their overall household costs. So yes, they can afford to pay the rent, but they can't afford to own the car, have the insurance, and the like. All of this stuff is connected, and you create other issues. So you still play whack-a-mole because housing, transportation, climate change. If you build your affordable housing only in certain parts, as it seems to be here from Housing Works analysis, only in certain districts in the city, then you're also probably increasing greenhouse gas emissions, which ultimately is going to increase the climate change effects that we're seeing. So you have to think about these things holistically. Otherwise, you're going to hit the housing mole, but another issue is going to pop up. And so you got to think about all of these things together, which means your solutions, your city departments, your foundations have to have intersectional, interdisciplinary ways of doing business. Because if they don't, it's just whack-a-mole. You're going to have, and I think from my understanding at least, the land development code process and how certain developments that happened over the years here are sort of emblematic of when you only deal with part of the issue and not all of them together. So that you just got to think about it in a holistic way. And one of the things we did, anybody here is interested in or been working on opportunity zones? So, see some hands. So the opportunity zone tax incentive, basically, lines have been drawn on a map around the country. There's 8,700 of them. And so what we did is we did an analysis of all 8,700 opportunity zones. And we said, well, what is the social equity in those opportunity zones? And what's the investment potential? What is the likelihood that people are going to want to do real estate development, which this is about, or business investment in these areas? And then what's the social equity? And one of the concepts or one of the components of social equity was transportation. And what we found, and you see this little grid, but if you look at the places that had the highest social equity for the people that lived in the area, lived in that opportunity zone, and the places that had simultaneously the highest likelihood of investment potential, it all came back to thinking holistically, because the metrics that we found were that mobility and walkability were key. So you'll see here in red, the places that had simultaneously in black these sort of good housing and jobs related metrics, but the places that ended up in the best place where the people who live in the area could stay in the area and investment could come were the places that also had high transit accessibility, had a combination of housing and transportation costs less than 45% of their total income, and had high other opportunities to walk. And so you have to think, if I'm trying to solve our housing affordability challenges, we got to think holistically, because everything we found, and this is an analysis from around the country, is that housing and transportation are all interwoven together. But it's not just transportation in terms of transit and how you get around, it's your transportation infrastructure. And this actually also goes back to not just being holistic, but thinking about history. So this was formerly East Avenue, right? And so then we built, and East Avenue at the time was sort of the psychological dividing line in the city, and you could literally cross that avenue and see the differences in property values, investment, and the like. But what really happened is when I-35 was built, it crystallized those forever. And we have to try to unpack that. So you have to think, well, hey, if I'm going to go build housing, what side of I-35 am I going to build it on? Where do I need to prioritize? And are we putting the transportation infrastructure in place that's going to exacerbate the issues, that's going to double down on this history, or are we going to do something different? And I don't want to pick on Austin totally, so you can see this around the country. So this was the Overton neighborhood in Miami. It was known as the sort of Harlem of the South, because at the time, this is where African Americans who had jazz and that sort of music culture, this was where they all played. And so transportation infrastructure. This highway was put right through the neighborhood, and it's never recovered. It's now and this was also a huge home of African American and Latinx businesses. So it was a thriving kind of middle to working class area, and now it's one of the poorest areas in the Miami area, and it's because of this transportation infrastructure. So again, if you're thinking about housing, you're thinking about affordability, but you're also thinking holistically about people's quality of life, you got to think about infrastructure too. And so you can't have your housing department working over here and your planning department working over here, but the folks who are working on infrastructure and transportation are in different departments and never talk to the other people. Do you have a housing plan that doesn't talk about transportation? Those are the challenges. The sign says gang injunctions for the gentrifiers because they were fighting against gentrification, but I would again say let's fight against displacement. But the other thing we have to think about, and this is when I talked about those metrics earlier and analyzing and knowing where the real issues are, is that when we looked at opportunity zones, and a lot of the opportunity zone conversation really starts to get to displacement, and we're worried about displacement, but what we found is where is the money going to go? And only 2% of all opportunity zones in the country are really at risk of displacement happening because of investment coming there. Which means that then you have to think about solutions that are different, and that's where, again, thinking holistically, you got to go into infrastructure. It's the infrastructure, the transportation, the mobility options, the public health options, the resilience in that community that will get you to the place that one day the real estate market will start moving, and then you'll have these issues of displacement. And oftentimes we're running around fighting about displacement when really we need to be putting in the right infrastructure to sort of get things going. And so you got to have that sort of mindset to say, is there really a gentrification and displacement issue here? And if there is, where is it most prevalent and where is it coming? That's the other thing. Know the history, but also try to think futuristically and where are things going. And get there before, as I like to say, get there before the guy in the plaid shirt with the beard and the Edison light bulb and the bar with the exposed brick. If you're there and you're trying to be in a meeting fighting against gentrification, it's too late. The train has already left the station. And so we got to get ahead of these things. And a lot of times, the canary in the coal mine, as they say, is the infrastructure. When they start changing the sidewalks, putting in green infrastructure, and all of those things, that's when the wheels are starting to turn, and that's when displacement potentially is coming. And so we got to go to those places before it happens. Because once that train starts rolling down the track, you can't get in front of the gentrification train. You just can't, or you get run over. So, press please. Another potentially controversial point, Richard Rothstein talks a lot about kind of the federal aspects of displacement, but I wanted to say something that might be cause for some concern, that part of the problem is you guys, is us. And it gets to this point about being futuristic. We all know where the next hot neighborhood is now. Whenever we worked on, if you work in city government, when you worked on the plan 7 years ago, you already knew where the infrastructure was going to go, where the new transportation was going to happen, where we were going to invest, where the new parks were going to be built, where the movement seems to be happening. So we are as much part of the problem if we don't say, let's think ahead and where are things going. That's when we can stop things. And so we as policymakers, if you're a foundation and you're funding, fund not only fighting against current problems, fund thinking about where things are going, and then let's do interventions there. So I just like, lots of times it's sort of like we get in these, we're sort of preaching to the choir and we're like, oh, those bad people out there, they're causing displacement. We're part of the problem too. And so we just have to acknowledge that. I talked about fear, and let's talk about the land development code a little bit, but that also is part of the infrastructure. If you don't have a land development code and zoning rules and the like that allow you to do the types of things that you want to do in terms of affordable housing, you never get there. And so you'll find a lot of cities that mayors will make a grand announcement about affordable housing. We're going to bring 10,000 more units. And you talk to any real estate developer, whether they're market rate or affordable, and they're like, the zoning and the entitlement process will never allow us to get to that. It's impossible. So you guys are very smart to get into the land development code. I would not recommend spending $9 million in 7 years doing it. But, other than that, you guys are doing the right things. And your code is kind of old, right? It's a little, I know you're the cool kids, but the code is kind of old. And part of the problem is that code leads you to this. That code makes this the easiest thing to build. And that code, when you make this as the easiest thing to build, this goes back to these intersections. Housing leads to transportation. I got to have a car to get to these places. If I got to get a car to get to these places, this is the easiest thing to build, then people are driving, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change again. It's all kind of a cycle. And again, don't forget the history. This is out of Richard Rothstein's book as well. Zoning has been used as a force for bad. And so even as we redevelop and fix the development code, we have to realize, how was that development code used specifically for bad intentions, and have that be part of the decision making going forward. I wanted to make a quick health and equity pitch. And I know lots of folks here are sort of knee-deep in this work, but the big picture point I wanted to make, I always like this picture, so I throw that in there. The big picture point I wanted to make is these things are interconnected. And so if we have effects of climate change that cause more flooding, as an example, or actually longer and more frequent rain events, and that causes more flooding, but then you have vulnerable communities that live in single-family housing that then get flooded, but also don't have the income and wealth or resources to deal with that. And that flooding, as an example, if you're flooding your single-family home and that causes mold, and that mold and those spores cause more asthma. And I don't know if you guys know that asthma is not a genetically oriented disease. It's not like Tay-Sachs for Jewish people or even sickle cell anemia for African Americans. Asthma is caused by environmental issues and then exacerbated by them. So like black folks are not genetically disposed like they are with sickle cell anemia to having asthma, but they disproportionately have it. And partially it's because of this sort of vicious cycle. And you could see this vicious cycle because equity was not thought about when you were making the decision. So again, thinking holistically. Equity will never be the default option unless you say, how will this affect our most vulnerable? How will this affect the folks with the least resources? And make decisions with that as a priority. You can't back into that. And I think a lot of times we say, what is the right answer? Oh yeah, what about equity? And in equity and these issues of health have to be on the forefront, because if you don't put them on the forefront, they sort of get lost in the sauce. Quick example from Baton Rouge, and I don't want you to look at this woman's socks, by the way. But this is a perfect example of infrastructure. If you notice she has an umbrella up, but it's not raining, it's because of heat. And this is what we see in a lot of our lower income, low wealth neighborhoods, where the most vulnerable to already having issues of asthma, which are exacerbated by exposure to heat. And so you're in the type of neighborhoods, because of the redlining that happened and therefore the disinvestment that happened, you disproportionately live in the areas where you suffer from excessive heat. You have these health effects. It all is a cycle. And there was a study, it was done by Harvard, and it said, if you compare people of color to white people, I'm just using the terms they use, and you compare the amount of air pollution they're exposed to, what would you say is the difference in terms of people of color, the increased amount of air pollution compared to white Americans? Would you say it's 10% more air pollution? 20%? 30%? Do I got a 50%? Okay, 150%. I'm going to go with, the answer was 66%. Those are all our infrastructure, transportation, and other decisions, because guess who lives near I-35? So when you live under the highway and there's congestion, because we built single-family homes, we suburbanized our cities, and people stuck in traffic, but that congestion sits in a certain place, and those emissions go to communities of color. So It's all interwoven. And when you're thinking about, if you really care about climate change and you're focused on housing, you got to realize that transportation actually is the biggest cause of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's not just whether the building is LEED platinum or silver or whatever it is, and therefore the building is green. It's actually how we're thinking about our land use and our built environment that leads to the emissions. So you got to think about transportation. And frankly, this was an example actually specifically from Seattle. It talks about the air quality in communities of color were disproportionately bad, and particularly disproportionately bad, not only in communities of color, but lower income communities of color. And again, that goes back to the history. That's not by accident. That was by design. And so we have to think of solutions that, by design, as Richard Rothstein said earlier, try to undo these things on purpose. And that requires acknowledging the history of how we got there. Because if we don't, you end up with this. And if you have more multifamily housing and more density and not just single family homes, these climate change effects wouldn't end up with issues like this. And this is actually, I was in Baton Rouge, and this was a picture of Baton Rouge after, not a hurricane, but just like a multi-day rain event. So another reason why we have to change our land development code to get to density is not just because we want more housing, it's because we have to become more resilient to climate change, and that's going to require density because we can't have people just living in houses as we know we're going to flood. We know this is going to happen. It's already happening. So just wanted to wrap it up with just a couple quick thoughts about what you can do in addition to thinking holistically, in addition to thinking about the history. And putting health and equity at the forefront. You got to change your process. And I show this picture of a turkey because it reminds me of my favorite saying. And so you have to and you guys have actually done a really great job of saying, we want to make sure that the right people have more input. But part of the challenge is you got to get past input. One is acknowledge the history, but you got to get to power. It can't just be that people are giving you input. They actually have to have power and some control in the design and the decision making and the outcomes. So we have to say who's at the table making these decisions, who are the city leaders, not just whether somebody's on a task force, but at the end of the day, does that input translate to power, translate to changes in privilege? And Oakland actually has been able to do a good job of this when they said, well, part of the way to make the process more equitable is to actually think out of the box about the process. We've set up the process where only with people with the privilege of being able to go to a school basement at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, the privilege of time and that type of job and childcare and mobility options and the like, unless you unpack that and give power to folks and go where they are. So we got to change the process. And Oakland was able to do that by rethinking the whole thing. It also goes to these infrastructure questions and prioritizing health and equity. This is a map of their final streets plan on where they were going to pave new streets. And what they said was, we're going to start in the neighborhoods that were disinvested because of this history of racism and bias and income bias. We're going to go to those neighborhoods first. And that's what you have to do, because you're not going to end up where we just say, hey, well, let's go put new sidewalks in the areas where all the market rate development is happening, which ends up being the default option in many cases. Well, there's all these new people moving into areas, and then you never get back to those same areas that were redlined over the years. And so you have to put equity first, and you have to do that not just in terms of housing, but also in terms of infrastructure. And finally, just change what's possible. This is actually right down the block for me. This is multifamily housing. Notice it would blend in perfect with single-family housing. And so we have to say to ourselves, we can't have this either-or way of thinking, and I know you guys are thinking out of the box in terms of duplexes and triplexes and the like, but we have to say to ourselves, how do we rethink what's possible and rethink what we can do and get to the challenges and the issues that people have by thinking of, is there another way so we can have not just an either-or, but an and. And this is sort of, to me, a design and in a sense of we can get more density, but it can also blend in. So overall, my main point here was we have to think holistically. We have to acknowledge, unpack, and be courageous enough to get into the history. And finally, think about health and equity on the forefront as a priority and specifically as an outcome and actually a decision factor in everything you do. And you have to do that because if you really want to solve these housing issues, these questions of gentrification and displacement, issues of climate change and the like, if you want to get to these issues, you can't just say, well, let's just focus on housing. We got to do all of the above, and otherwise you end up with a game of whack-a-mole. Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes to do questions. I know there was Slido, but also I think there are microphones somewhere in the audience. If people have questions, comments, want to quibble about anything I said, we'll see what pops up on Slido as well. I'm seeing a lot of zeros, which means I can just pick any one of these. And if anybody, but first, if anybody have a burning question that they want to actually come to a microphone. Oh, I see a hand back there. And I don't know where the microphone. Oh, Ashton, thank you, sir. And if you don't mind, for all of our, just tell us like your name and who you're associated with and your social security number and maiden name. No.
I'll just say that I'm local. So my question is that in gentrification, prior to people moving out, there was a sense, especially I would say here in Austin, where if you owned your home and you didn't have money, and for the first time in your life, someone came to you and said, I will pay you $35,000 or whatever the number was for you to move, a lot of people took that opportunity because living in a wooden house on stilts or on piers and having the ability to move into a brick home was a golden goose for a lot of people. And a lot of people, when Big Mama died, they took that opportunity and they moved. Now, I'm not saying that gentrification isn't real in East Austin, but I'm saying that it wasn't always necessarily gentrification, it was about economic opportunity. And that economic opportunity allowed a lot of people to move up in society for the first time. So that's just my starting point. So in the essence of gentrification, a lot of people in those areas said, we want services, we want certain types of shops, we want viability, we want these things. And the quest becomes, once you open that box, you can't close it. So once that area said, we want these things, it drove certain things to happen that brought in gentrification.
I get you. No, I understand exactly what you're talking about. I think one of the things that we always have to do is analyze the data to understand whether something that we know is true, is it true on the whole, or is it a subsection of the issue? So I'm going to have a working hypothesis that many of the folks that moved out of Austin that the lion's share of them did not move for economic opportunity alone. That if you actually were able to do this analysis, that yeah, there are definitely some folks who are like selling Big Mama's house, 35 grand, whatever I'm gonna go move, better place and the like. But I'm gonna guess that wasn't true for most people. And so one of the reasons to use data and metrics is to say, are we solving the right problem? We actually will know that that's not a problem. That's fine. People are making a voluntary decision. But there are probably more people that were moved out because they couldn't afford their property taxes. There were more people that were moved out because they actually didn't own that house they were in for 30. Big Mama was a renter, and someone gave her the privilege of staying in those rented houses. So you see this in a lot of places like DC, Baltimore, East Coast, West Coast, where folks didn't own. And that's one of the reasons I put nonprofits, policymakers, and foundations as part of the reasons for displacement, because we needed to help folks own, whether it's using community land trusts as an option, whether it's nonprofits. You know, there's blocks probably in this city right now where somebody could go buy that block tomorrow. Why don't we buy the block? Whether helping those communities buy the block for themselves, helping those folks become owners of their individual houses, or setting up community land trusts in the places where we know gentrification is coming. So I would say I agree that that definitely happens, but my guess is that is not the mode, that is not the one that happens most often. So we need to solve for what's the larger reasons for displacement, and the folks that, you know, are leaving for economic opportunity, we just snap for them and say, God bless you. So hopefully that addresses your thought. Let's see okay. Austin NIMBYs are anti-housing and anti-transit. How can we behave like a city when protecting expensive, unsustainable suburban lifestyles is the top goal? Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. You know, I think part of the challenge is, and this really gets to conversations, is understanding the why behind people's fight against a thing. So, you know, you do that little exercise where someone says, well, look, I don't want trains, I don't want Austin Urban Rail, which failed. I don't want that bond to pass because I don't want this particular transit coming to my neighborhood, to my community. And so you say, why? And they say, well, because, you know, I think it's gonna cause congestion. And you say, why? And I think if you start to use the why and continue to ask respectfully, you start to unpack and really get to their real reasons. So they might say, well, actually, I think it's going to bring the type of people to my neighborhood that I think will change the character of the neighborhood. Why? Why do you believe that? Is there data to show that when you bring transit to an area, it causes the neighborhood to change? Why do you believe that? Why? So I think some of it is really unpacking the why, but that only gets you a certain extent. The other is political leadership. And you have to use your vote to get the decision makers in place who are going to say, the bigger picture, these larger goals, I understand the suburban lifestyle, I understand that's been a goal, in some ways that was the American dream, but we know the ramifications of that dream in terms of public health issues and bad outcomes, climate change issues and not being resilient. We understand the use of cars and the additional expense of having everyone have to own a car. At some point you have to have political leaders and decision makers who say, one of the reasons you elected me is to have this larger picture, these longer term goals in mind, not just an individual decision and the like. And so you got to elect the leaders, the city. I mean, one of the reasons your land development code is as far as it is because you have leaders who have coalesced and you voted in the right people who are pushing this forward. And that's what you have to do. So I know it's hard, but you have to have the leaders. First of all, you have to unpack why people are fighting, and you'll be able to turn some people based on really unpacking their why, and once you get to there. But then some of it is just leaders who are going to just say, this is the way we're going, and let me just tell you why. Any other people in the audience versus me going up here? Okay. Renters often disproportionately don't have a seat at the table, resulting in displacement policy being skewed towards homeowner needs. How do we shift that? Well, that goes back to that slide I showed you in Oakland. Part of it really is changing the engagement process, because right now we have a couple of biases. One, our entire engagement process is biased towards people who like to talk. I say it as a talker, right? You have to get up in a meeting and testify, or even in a small group, and you're like, oh, well, you know, the planners told me we're going to do focus group sessions and that, you know, allow. Like, some people aren't going to be as articulate in person saying things to you, whether you're in a group of 100 or a group in 5. So we have to give them other ways to give their input. Some of it will be virtual. Some of it might be app-based. Some of it might be gamification-based, where we can learn kind of what they think indirectly. But so some of it is you got to change the sort of process. The other is, where are the renters? So we have to go to where the renters are. And some of it, since a lot of renters, not all of renters, but a lot of renters will have the type of jobs that they can't come to a community meeting. So where are they? How do we get to them? So I think it's really, some of it is just process. And some of it is to say, are there coalitions of advocates too who are being reached out to, who represent renters and basically understand not only from a technical policy or academic perspective, but also from a lived experience perspective. But it's a great point, and basically we need to reach out and bring renters into the conversation. I'll keep looking for hands out there, but okay. Ooh, okay, I got 2 7s, so let's see. How are opportunity zones good for renters who are especially prone? You said we often use data as info, not part of the solution. What does it look like to use data as part of the solution rather than only the path to it? I'm going to take that one. Some of it really, we're doing a lot more in terms of what we'll call data visualization, mapping. You'll notice the Housing Works thing that I showed earlier was really an infographic. So part of it is we're sort of flush with data. There's a lot of data out there. There's a lot, but it's not really information. It's not really usable. And it's actually not translated in a way that a broad spectrum of people can both understand it, but then take that data, turn it into information, and then turn it into a tool for the solution. So I think some of it is, well, let's use more and more ways, and it could be video, let's use more and more ways to take data and turn it into usable information for the people that need to use it to get to the solutions, and that might be infographics, but also I think mapping. Like everybody gets maps, and sometimes you can show bar charts and all of the data, and it's all right, it's all correct, but then you can show a map with the same information. And so we found a lot of traction. We do like fiscal impact analyses and the like to show like where these decisions will change how things happen in communities and how it will affect them. And a lot of what we do now is, what is the sort of visualization tactic we can use to take this data, take these metrics, take this information, take these formulas, and have people visualize it. Another thing I would say is contextualize it. So how do we, when you're in a meeting, you put up a site plan, people are like, I don't even know what a site plan is. So like remind them, like educate. So I think some of it is really like taking that and saying, maybe we have to take a couple of steps back and be less fancy and actually bring them up to speed on how we think about this data, why this metric is important, how it affects them. And frankly too, if we can, going from just input to power, have them be part of the data gathering process. Because what you'll also find is, if you actually go to folks, you might go to a group of renters, you might go to a bunch of African Americans, go to the Latinx community, and you might find that they might collect different data than you would. And so a lot of times we come in with our sort of academic backgrounds and our understanding of analysis, but what we don't have is sometimes lived experience would say, there's a set of information that you're not even thinking about, those questions you're not asking. So we need to bring folks into that process. So not only we're like telling them, here's the data we found and why it's important, ask them, well, what information would you want to know to make these decisions? And oftentimes that'll be illuminating.
My name is Nefertiti, and I do work with the City of Austin Neighborhood Housing and Community Development. My question has to do with how do you prioritize displacement or anything else when the city can have competing values or priorities? And the specific example that I'd like to give, I'm concerned about the potential displacement to the remaining residents east of I-35. There's a plan to do a cap and stitch of I-35 as a way to sort of heal that intersection and expand transportation. But then also, there's the Innovation District that's, we're saying it's going to bring 2,800 jobs. And I forgot how much money, millions of dollars that will be coming into downtown Austin, and then also a medical district. So I'm thinking about all of these additional pressures, displacement pressures, but we say we care about displacement, and I'm trying to figure out where is the concern for the unintended consequences of the people who are the most vulnerable to displacement.
Yeah, I mean, that's a serious question. I would say a couple of things. Part of it is really having an intentionality and being clear-eyed that that's a problem. So right off the bat, part of the challenge is, like you said, the unintentional consequences, but sometimes there's a level of kind of willful ignorance of the ramifications of choices that first you have to get past. You have to sort of say, we see this as an issue. The second is, we often are, like I said earlier, kind of too late. We're trying to fight the problem when this issue, the train has already left the station. It's too late to do anything. None of those folks own their homes and the like. The other thing I would say is sometimes we have to stop thinking about this as, like, for example, housing affordability or people to stay in their homes. Stop thinking about it as a supply issue, but also as a demand issue. And what I mean by that is, are we doing the type of workforce development and education and capacity building so that people can afford to stay and actually understand what financial choices they need to make before the gentrification train actually comes to the neighborhood? So part of the challenge too is we're like, oh, well, let's save them by building more affordable housing. Why don't we also try to not just play defense, but play offense and give them the tools to stay because they want to stay? Because now they have the right job, they have the mobility options, they have the resources. They've been trained on financial wherewithal to say, well, what can I do as a renter to be able to buy? Because you'll find examples of there was the opportunity that they could have bought that house that they were renters in and just hadn't been trained and given the capacity and the forethought to prepare for that moment. So I would say play offense and defense. And oftentimes a lot of the conversations about defense, saving folks, protecting folks, it's almost like putting barriers up rather than saying, let's let them be able to play offense and be able to stay themselves. So thank you. And I think our time is up. So thanks, everybody.